Hello and welcome to I Know Dino. Keep up with the latest dinosaur discoveries and science with us. I'm Garrett.
And I'm Sabrina.
And today in our 511th episode, we've got a bunch of news.
All about hadrosaurs, switching things up this week. There's 2 new hadrosaur dinosaurs that have been discovered that help show us that dinosaurs were doing well in the late Cretaceous. Plus, there's some hadrosaur bone beds that tell us how these dinosaurs lived. They lived in segregated age groups. And in non-hadrosaur news, there's an update to the new Jurassic World movie that's coming out next year. And then last but not least, we have some big personal news. We're expecting our second baby soon.
We are?
Very funny. That means that we're going to be taking some time off for parental leave starting later in the fall. We're going to approach it a little bit differently from how we did it last time because there's just a lot more to juggle when you've got an active toddler.
Yes.
But don't worry, we will still be releasing new content regularly.
Yeah, we're going to do bi-weekly episodes because in our last survey, we asked if people would be okay with us switching to bi-weekly, and most people said yes. And we're going to test that hypothesis by going bi-weekly for at least some of the parental leave time.
If you're on our newsletter list, though, you'll still be getting content weekly.
Yeah, and we'll still be releasing episodes of I Know Paleo once a month. So if you are a patron, it'll be 3 out of 4 weeks in a month. There will be something new.
Yes.
We might fill in some more stuff too. We'll see.
But back to this episode, we also have an interview with Edward Dolnick, author of Dinosaurs at the Dinner Party. And we've got Dinosaur of the Day, Theiophytalia, which is an Iguanodontian from the Garden of the Gods. And our fun fact, which is that matching dinosaur tracks have been found on 2 different continents over 3,700 miles or 6,000 kilometers apart.
Are they eubrontes?
They didn't say what kind, but it's a mix of sauropod and theropod and other tracks.
Oh, it's like a whole fauna of tracks that match. Oh, that's interesting.
But, we're getting way ahead of ourselves here.
And we're also going to announce the winner of our Dynamite prize package for the Dino-It-All Challenge, which wrapped up about a week and a half ago now, and we picked a winner. But before we get into all of that, as always, we'd like to thank some of our patrons, and this week we'd like to thank Keith, Chuck, Ermel, Jurassic Jim, Albertosaurus, Trent Carbajal, Fernando and his mom Maria, Tyrant King, Steph, and Paul B. We're feeling especially thankful because without our Patreon, it would be impossible for us to take any parental leave because we would be solely reliant on advertising money, and we don't get advertising money when we don't release new episodes. So thank you very much to all of our patrons for helping us to keep our podcast going, helping to keep our lives going, and helping us just in general. So thank you all so much. And if you would like to join, you can head over to patreon.com/iknowdino,
where you'll get a whole bunch of perks too, in addition to our thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Jumping into the news, as I promised, there are 2 new hadrosaur dinosaurs, and I'll start with the new kritosaurin hadrosaur dinosaur, Coahuilasaurus lipani. This was published by Nicholas Longrich and others in Diversity, and it's open access, so it will be a link in our show notes if you want to check it out for yourselves. Kritosaurins, if that name sounds familiar at all, it includes the dinosaurs Kritosaurus and Griposaurus.
Figured Kritosaurus would be in there.
Yeah.
Griposaurus is a cool one.
Yeah, and they are very much linked because for a long time, it was all thought to be Griposaurus.
Okay.
They're a subgroup of Saurolophinae, which are mostly non-crested hadrosaurs. The paleoart for Coahuilasaurus shows a really large nasal arch and a beak on a robust head and neck.
So it's got sort of a bump on the top of its snout? Is that what a nasal arch is?
Yes, that was the best way I could think to describe it. It's a really cool piece of paleoart. For the bones that they found of this dinosaur, though, they found parts of the upper and lower jaw and other fragments of the skull bone, so the front parts of the skull. And from that, they were able to estimate that it was about 26 feet or 8 meters long. Coahuilasaurus lived in the late Cretaceous about 72.5 million years ago in what is now Coahuila, Mexico, in the Serra del Pueblo Formation. The genus name means Coahuila lizard. The species name, lipani, and I'm saying the Latinized version of the pronunciation here, It's in honor of the Lipani, a tribe of Apache Native Americans known from the area. Originally, Coahuilasaurus was thought to be in the same genus as an unnamed specimen known as Sabina's hadrosaurid, but that hadrosaurid is now thought to be nested within Saurolophini. And then, what's now Coahuilasaurus was later referred to Kritosaurus navajovius, which is a hadrosaur known for its Roman nose because it had a bridge. But it's younger than Kritosaurus by about 1 million years, and it also has features in common with Gripposaurus monumentus. It's more similar to Gripposaurus than Kritosaurus, but there's still enough differences to make it separate, including having longer nostrils. It's a large size, it's robust, it's got a strongly downturned lower jaw or dentary, large denticles, and a more prominent chin, and the corner of the beak is more squared off.
Ooh, serrated teeth. That's interesting for a hadrosaur.
Yeah, specifically to say massive denticles on the premaxilla's palatal surface.
So it's not actually a serrated tooth, it's serrations on the palate itself. That's really interesting and weird.
Fun facts about hadrosaurs.
Well, in this one, right? It's a unique feature.
It is. So that's what Nick Longrich wrote on his blog, that the main giveaway is, quote, a series of massive tooth-like structures project down from the roof of the mouth. Presumably they function to help the beak seize and tear tough plant matter.
That's cool. It reminds me of some birds. Some of the birds today that are called like quote-unquote toothed birds, but they actually have like serrated bills. That's basically what this hadrosaur had going on, but it also had teeth.
Lots of ways to eat plants.
Mm-hmm.
Coahuilasaurus lived on a floodplain. There were a lot of crocodiles, turtles, and bivalves found in the same formation, as well as a fast-running ornithomimosaur and teeth from various theropods like tyrannosaurids, dromaeosaurids, troodontids, and a lot of ornithischians like Phlotlolophus.
Phlotlolophus.
Thank you. I can't say it the way you say it. And some unnamed ankylosaurs and ceratopsids. So this new dinosaur, Coahuilasaurus, helps show that there's a lot of diversity in the formation, even more than the Horseshoe Canyon Formation in Alberta, which is from around the same time. So it may mean that there was some declining herbivore diversity, like just fewer herbivorous dinosaur species that happened at a more local level rather than a global level in the late Cretaceous. And it could be because of cooling temperatures at high latitudes.
It's always the hard thing with paleontology. You have to do a lot of extrapolating to the globe because you don't find all times in all places. You find one time in this spot and a different time in that spot. So putting together what was happening in the whole world at a time is pretty much impossible.
It's like putting together the dinosaur is the first jigsaw puzzle, and then it's part of an even larger puzzle when you put all the dinosaurs together to figure out their ecosystem and what was going on.
Yeah, but you never get all the dinosaurs and all the ecosystems.
You get pieces, yeah.
Yeah.
Next up, there's a new hadrosauroid ornithopod dinosaur, Qianjiangsaurus changshengi. This was published in Cretaceous Research by Hui Dai and others. They found a partial skeleton, including parts of the jaw, back and tail bones, several leg bones and feet, an ankle bone, and most of the hip bones. It's one of the few hadrosauroids named from South China. There is another one that's been named Naningasaurus. Qianjiangsaurus lived in the late Cretaceous in what is now Chongqing Municipality, China, found in the Zhengyang Formation. Hadrosauroidea is a clade of dinosaurs that lived in the Cretaceous, and they've been found in Asia, Europe, North and South America, Africa, and Antarctica. They're known for their duckbills and their dental batteries. Qianjiangsaurus, I would say it looks similar to Hadrosaurus. It's built a bit chunky, like in the paleoart, it looks very robust. It could walk on all fours, though its legs are a bit longer than the arms. It had a long tail, it had a long head, a thick neck, and a ridge on the back. The fossils were found in 2022 in Qianjiang, where the genus name comes from. And the species name changshengi is in honor of Changshen Wang, who found the area with the dinosaur fossils. So the skeleton they found, they think, is probably a mature adult, and it's estimated to be about 26 feet or 8 meters long, so medium-sized, and similar in size to Coahuilasaurus.
Yeah, I was just thinking that.
What's interesting is Qianjiangsaurus had some ancestral or plesiomorphic traits as well as derived features that are seen in later hadrosaurs, so it's kind of a transitional form between the two. It had 30 tooth positions with no more than 5 teeth per tooth socket. It also had 7 fused vertebrae in the sacrum, so it's got its own unique combination of features. There's also a fan-shaped prepubic process of the pubis. It's a bony extension that goes forward from the hip socket toward the front of the animal. So there we go. Those are our 2 new hadrosaurs.
Nice.
Now, in other hadrosaur news, we've got a paper that shows a hadrosaur living in groups separated by age. So the juveniles live separately from adults, specifically about the hadrosaur Hypacrosaurus. This was published by Tristan Jobarn and others in Paleogeography, Paleoclimatology, Paleoecology. And Hypacrosaurus was our dinosaur day back in episode 345, but I'll give a brief overview here. It lived in the late Cretaceous in what is now Alberta, Canada. It's estimated to be about 30 feet or over 9 meters long and weigh 4.4 tons. And it had a tall, hollow, rounded crest, and sometimes it's been described as having a helmet crest. The team studied Hypacrosaurus bone beds, and they found groups segregated by age. And it seems that these Hypacrosaurus stayed apart until they were about 4 years old. And also the size of their groups got smaller the older they got.
So there are huge groups of them running around. By the time they were older, it's just a few of them.
Yeah, it might have been like they all hatched together and hung out together. And then as they got older, they needed to eat more. So they had smaller groups.
Or maybe as they got eaten, and the group dwindled.
Well, there is that aspect too, yes. So with hadrosaurs, a lot of trackways and bone beds have been found, and our current understanding is that they lived in herds. But it's been kind of unclear if the younger ones lived in herds with the older ones, or if they segregated by age, or if they did both. A lot of bone beds found don't have juveniles, so that suggests the age segregation. But if that's the case, it's unclear how long the young lived apart from the older ones and at what age they rejoined the herd. So for this study, there are 3 bone beds of Hypacrosaurus, and they show individuals at different growth stages, or different ages. There's the Devil's Coulee Juvenile Hadrosaur Bone Bed, the JBB, from the Ullman Formation of Alberta. There's at least 4 late juveniles in that one. They're all similar in size. They're about 3 years old based on histology, where they cut thin slices of bone and counted the lags or the tree rings. And the JBB has 221 bones, I think is what they mean by specimens.
Yeah.
As well as parts of tyrannosaurs and other theropods like dromaeosaurs and ornithomimids, and a crocodilia scute. There's also scutes and teeth from ankylosaurs, turtle shell fragments, and bits of fish. But they do know that at least 4 hadrosaurs are preserved because of the number of left fibulae, left leg bones. There are a lot of other parts of the skeletons that have been found, but it's just hard to know how many individuals those skeletons made up.
But it sounds like the one that had the most common definitive bone that an animal only has one of is the left fibulae, and that number is 4.
Yes.
So you get the minimum number of 4.
Exactly. That's how they figured that out.
But there could be more, and some of them just didn't have their left fibulae preserved.
Yes. So the other bone bed that they looked at is the Blacktail Creek North, the BCNB bone bed from the Two Medicine Formation of Montana. This one had 23 early juveniles. Previously, they were known as nestling individuals. They're all under 1 year old. And the way that they estimated that there's 23 of them was based on the number of right dentaries, lower jaw bones.
Yep, you only have 1 jaw per animal.
Yes.
Unless you're like a moray eel or something. But we don't know of any hadrosaurs that have multiple sets of jaws.
Just a whole bunch of teeth.
Mm-hmm.
So clutch sizes are about 22 eggs, and having the 23 individuals, that's just similar in numbers to the clutch sizes. And then last, there's the Lambeocyte, or the LB bone bed, also from Two Medicine. And that one has 4 late juvenile individuals, also around 3 years old, that are similar in size, plus 1 adult. So they've got 5 individuals there. And they estimated 5 individuals based on the number of arm bones.
So it sounds like that one had a little bit of age mixing, at least.
Mm-hmm. Skull fossils are rare at 2 of the sites, at least the JBB and the LB.
Sound like band names.
I was thinking of that Sublime song. They're talking about the
LBC.
LBC, yeah. The JBB, me and Louis. Anyway, the fossils, they do have features that look like Hypacrosaurus, though. And there are embryo Hypacrosaurus identified at a nesting site at Devil's Coulee, located about 33 feet or 10 meters below the JBB. Also, Hypacrosaurus is the only known lambeosaurine from the Upper Oldman Formation and Upper Two Medicine Formation. So it seems likely that, yes, these are Hypacrosaurus. All these bone beds are thought to be mass mortality assemblages, meaning they all died around the same time. And it could be from flooding or it could be from a drought. These sites were from seasonal wetlands in an arid to semi-arid environment, so it's possible that they all died from a drought. They also had all signs of similar fossilization, where possibly the bones were transported by river over a short distance. Also, there's not much weathering on the bones. There's not really any tooth marks on them either. In the JBB, some theropod tooth marks were found, but not many, so maybe they were scavenged a little bit, but not too much.
Just a little bit of scavenging.
Yeah. Based on these 3 bone beds, though, it seems like, yes, juveniles lived apart from the herds with the older individuals. The juveniles were about 50% the size of the adults, and then around 4 years old, they got to be about 60% adult size. And then later they would rejoin the older herd, because we've got, again, those 5 individuals where it's 4 later juveniles and 1 adult. And like you were saying, Garrett, it could be that they had these smaller groups as they're older because, well, they just didn't survive being so young. Or maybe they separated into smaller groups as they grew up and needed more food. That's the one that I like to think about.
Rather than just a sort of battle royale situation where they're shrinking in numbers.
Yes.
Yeah. The rejoining the older herd based on one fossil site where there's like one individual at a slightly older age seems like a little bit of a stretch. But I do appreciate that finding so many, like 23 of these individuals together that are all about the same age without any adult bones around is pretty significant, especially because usually larger bones preserve better. So you would expect that if you could find 23 juvenile individuals, you would find at least 1 adult if they were mixed in with a whole bunch of other ages.
Mm-hmm.
And I should also point out that just because this Hypacrosaurus and maybe another dinosaur type acted this way doesn't mean that all hadrosaurs split into groups this way.
Yes.
And it could even be that there were differences in time or in region, and that one that had mixing was mixed up at all ages. And it wasn't like, oh, they only mixed up once they got older.
Yeah. Again, it's hard to tell from the snapshot in time.
Yeah.
But bone beds do tell you a lot.
Yeah. Especially about that group, but not necessarily about them generally. Just like you were talking about with whether or not the herbivores were in decline at the end of the Cretaceous.
Mm-hmm.
Like you could show in that one specific spot, maybe they were or weren't, but it's hard to say globally.
Yes. Although in that case, that contributes to the debate on were dinosaurs in decline before they went extinct?
Nope.
No, there's pockets that show otherwise.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of dinosaurs all over the world, I mentioned before that the new Jurassic World film, which is coming out next July 2nd, 2025 specifically, it already has a title.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, it's going to be called Jurassic World Rebirth. And in the movie, there's going to be a team racing to get DNA samples from 3 large animals from land, sea, and air 5 years after Jurassic World Dominion. I couldn't bring myself to say 3 large dinosaurs because sea
and air.
I mean, there were dinosaurs that were in the air, but not very large ones.
Yeah. Yeah, there were some in the sea too. I mean, I don't know if Spinosaurus would have been in the sea, probably more of like a river type situation. But you did have things like Hesperornis.
Yeah.
And some of the other really bird-like dinosaurs, but they were quite small.
Yes. So wouldn't make sense for this movie. And it turns out that present-day Earth is just not hospitable to the dinosaurs.
We've talked about that.
Yeah. So a lot of the dinosaurs, after 5 years, have ended up living around the equator.
Yeah, makes sense.
It does. And the reason that this team's going after the 3 large animals is that they can help with some kind of drug that's going to benefit humankind.
Oh, weird. That's not what I was expecting you to say. I was thinking because it's like a trophy, or because they want to make a zoo, or they want to do this or that. Not that they were going to use them, like drain their blood for making drugs.
I think we're done with the zoo theme park part of it.
I guess so, yeah.
Yeah, so we'll see. I'm sure there'll be a lot more details coming out over the next few months.
It sounds like there's going to be a lot more people out in the world mixing in with dinosaurs, which is what I always want to see in these movies.
Maybe. Or it might be focused on this team.
But still.
Yeah.
As long as they're out in the real world and it's like, dinosaur. That's what I like from Jurassic Park.
Well, we'll find out next July.
It's true. And we'll get into our interview with Edward in just a moment, but first we're going to pause for a quick sponsor break. And now onto our interview with Edward Dolnick, where we're going to talk all about Victorians and how they viewed dinosaurs, which was really interesting. It wasn't a topic that I had thought too much about. And I also didn't know enough about Victorian science and Victorian pop culture to really appreciate how dinosaurs would fit into it.
Mm-hmm.
But as always, we have an extended version of this interview for our patrons. So if you are a patron and you'd like to listen to the extended version, pop over to your premium content feed and you can get it there. And of course, if you haven't already, you can join our Patreon at patreon.com/iknowdino, and then you'll get access to that interview and about 100 more and a whole bunch of other stuff. But without further ado, on to our interview. We're joined this week by Edward Dolnick. He's the author of the book Dinosaurs at the Dinner Party, which is about how a group of Victorians discovered prehistoric animals and it changed our understanding of the world. Thank you so much for joining us this week.
Oh, my pleasure.
So I know you did a ton of research for this book, and you were just telling us before we started recording that it was really fun because it turns out the main characters, I suppose, they're real people, but had these larger than life backgrounds and personalities.
Yeah, well, whenever you set out to write a book, one of the important things to be sure of is that you like the people you're writing about, because for a couple of years, they're going to show up at breakfast and over coffee. And so you want to be glad when they turn up instead of cringe and turn away. And I liked these characters.
Yes.
Nice. So I guess we should also address the title of the book, Dinosaurs at the Dinner Party. Is that, I think I know what that's in reference to, but do you want to share with our listeners what that is about?
Well, the title, which you're absolutely right, is a strange title, is meant to do a couple of things at once. One is that it's a little silly, and that's meant to convey this is not homework. This is going to be fun. This is quite a story. But the bigger point of the title, Dinosaurs at the Dinner Party, is that at the time that scientists found these giant bones, which was in the early 1800s, they had a picture that the natural world was a safe and cozy place. The birds were tweeting along and deer were leaping and all was well. And then all of a sudden they find these giant bones. They're as tall as a person and nobody knows what in the world they are, except that they don't belong here. There's giant teeth. There's giant ribs. What's going on? And so it's kind of as if you were having dinner with some friends and everything was nice and cozy. And all of a sudden, like in a horror movie, there comes this scratching at the window and you say, uh-oh, what's that? And so the dinosaurs were the intruders. They were the interlopers on the scene when everything was cozy and all of a sudden, maybe not so cozy.
And definitely one of the topics of the Victorian time is the Industrial Revolution. And with that comes so much construction and so much digging into the ground, not only to make space for buildings, but also to get those materials for buildings. And that's where a lot of those discoveries came from too. And I presume that maybe part of the reason that dinosaurs became such a major focus at that point was because now you're finding these more complete skeletons, which people hadn't really just been excavating enough earth to uncover as much in the past.
Yes, if you found a bit of ankle bone or a knocked off chunk of rib, it might be neat and maybe you would put it on your mantelpiece or something. But to actually, just as you say, to find a skeleton, Now, this is really, really different. It won't fit on the mantelpiece for one thing, but more important than that, it raises really, really smack you in the face questions about what's going on. Who was this? And in the Industrial Revolution, just as you say, this is an era of frenzied digging. They're digging up canals and railroad beds and roadways. So these early dinosaur discoveries come in England, not because England was thicker with dinosaurs than other places, but because England was earlier on to the digging game than other parts of the world.
Yeah, that's something I hadn't thought about before, but because we often just talk about the dinosaurs, but they're part of, such a larger story and being found and a big part of like knowing human history and how that kind of factors into how these discoveries are made. It's fascinating.
If you look at it from afar, you picture these bones deep in the earth and humans going about their life and not knowing. And at some point, someone is going to dig a well or dig a canal or something, and they're going to find them. So it was bound to happen at some point. And by the time of 1800 or so, as we say, when digging was going on like mad, that's when people started bumping into these bones left and right.
Yeah. I guess the only other way that people find bones other than digging is they need to erode naturally out of something. But in those situations, you need conditions where there weren't traditionally a lot of people, because it's usually pretty inhospitable places without a lot of vegetation, where it's just basically barren rocks that are wearing down places like Mongolia or the Badlands in the US. But there's also Lyme Regis and just the cliffs around the UK. And I think we heard that you did some research in those areas too. What was that like?
Well, it was great, Fran. Lyme Regis is the town where some of the best and earliest prehistoric creatures were found. They weren't dinosaurs, although the word was later used in a kind of general sense to mean anything very big and very old. But Lyme Regis is on the English Channel on the south coast of England. It's big, steep cliffs. Nowadays, it's a resort town, and you go there to paddleboard or to eat ice cream and spend the day on the beach with your family. But in the early 1800s, there wasn't such a thing as a beach vacation. The seashore was a place to stay away from. That's where smugglers hung out. That's where sailors were, and they were kind of a rough and nasty crowd. But at some point around 1800, well-off Englishmen who used to go to Europe for vacation now couldn't, because Napoleon had torn up Europe. He was everything was at war. It wasn't safe to go there, but you'd want to go somewheres. And someone invented the beach holiday. And now all of a sudden, well-off people were going to the seashore, which changed from being a rough place to being an enticing place. And the best, as it would turn out, of these early fossil finders was a woman named Mary Anning, who lived in this little town of Lyme Regis. She had an uncanny knack for spotting a bump where it didn't belong in a rock or in the cliff, and digging at it and finding something. First, she found little things, which she sold just as trinkets to these holiday goers. But then as she dug more, she found better and better things. And now the market wasn't simply people who'd come for a break from work, but it was museums and things like that. They could pay much more. And what Mary did, she was poor all her life. She needed the money from making these sales. So she would sell these fossils, the big showy ones, to collectors, and the collectors would turn around and donate them to museums. And the museum would put the collector's name very prominently, a generous gift. But Mary's name was lost for decades, even though she was the one who had done the work.
Yes. And she had some scary situations happen when she was going fossil hunting too. Some near-death experiences.
Yeah, it turns out I had pictured, not knowing anything, that looking for these fossils would be like people who volunteer for highway cleanup. You walk along and here's a tin can and here's a soda bottle, and you just bend up and you put them in a bag, and when you have enough, you go home. But their fossils in real life are nearly always hidden much, much better than that. You don't see an enormous skeleton. You see a tiny crack in a rock with maybe a funny shape or a funny color in there, and then to dig it away takes ages. For Mary Anning, in these cliff sides at Lyme Regis, the best time to hunt was after a storm. So typically in winter, when waves and high winds have battered these cliffs that she was looking at. And more than once, as you say, the cliffs tumbled down around her. Once her dog, she was a great dog lover, always brought her dog with her on these fossil hunting missions. Once she's standing there and the cliff tumbles down, and there her dog Trey, poor Trey, is buried under the rocks. Mary can't save him, and she barely escaped herself.
So I recognized a lot of familiar names in the book, but that's only because we've been doing this podcast for almost 10 years.
Ooh.
Robert Plott, Pliny Moody, Mary Anning, of course, Gideon Mantell, William Buckland, George Cuvier, Richard Owen. When you were doing your research, did you have any favorites as you were learning their stories?
Well, I was always glad to see certain people come on stage. William Buckland, because he was the geologist and one of the great early scientists to catch on to what was doing to the age of the earth and this sort of thing. But he was a mad eccentric, so it was wonderful to have him around and just overflowing with energy. At one point, they find fossil print somewheres, and it dawns on him that his pet tortoise, when it walks along in the mud, leaves tracks that look kind of the same. And I should say his pet tortoise, his whole house, Buckland's house, looked as if Noah's Ark had crashed into the front door. He had jackals and parrots and snakes, and as well as every kind of fossil. Down the middle of his dining room table, he had the great backbone of one of Mary Anning's sea creatures, and he poked candles in it as a sort of makeshift candelabra. So the whole house is knee deep in cages and critters. And as I say, a giant tortoise in the backyard. So he sees these fossil prints that look like his tortoise footprints, and he wakes up his wife, who was an equally game character, and they cover the table with flour and water like pie crust. They've got the whole dining room table covered, and they hoist this tortoise up, and they set him walking across the pie crust to leave his footprints in, and they see to their delightment, to their thrilled excitement, that the footprints of the modern day tortoise and these ancient tracks in the mud look just alike. And so they think they figured out who eons and eons ago it was who walked through the mud. It was some prehistoric creature. So that kind of enthusiasm really won him over to me. Some of the enthusiasms were harder to understand. He not only knew and cherished nearly every creature that flew and slithered and ran, but somehow he'd taken in his head to eat most of them as well. And so dinner in the Buckland household was always this fearsome invitation. At one point, he served up a dinner of mice on toast. He served hedgehogs and moles and crocodiles. And so when you were invited over for dinner, it was very much a mixed blessing.
It's kind of bringing a new meaning to the title of your book, Dinosaurs at the Dinner Party, too.
Yes, that too. This was a dinner party that you weren't sure if you wanted to be invited to or not. And another one of the characters you asked about, these strange, larger-than-life people, was Richard Owen, who was the person who came up with the name Dinosaur. Owen was before Darwin, which is when the book is set, in the first half of the 1800s. Darwin comes along in 1859. But before Darwin, Richard Owen is the most famous scientist in England, and he's a larger-than-life character, too. He's brilliant for one thing, but he's bombastic and brash and full of himself and a backstabber. You don't want to cross him, because he will shoot you down. He will steal credit for your discoveries and take it for himself, all with this kind of self-righteousness that naturally he would do that, because what could be a greater honor for you than to have your work taken up by him? And on top of this strange, over-the-top character he had a very, very odd look too. He was tall and skinny, kind of bony, with a giant high forehead and these enormous eyes like a prehistoric creature. And as he got older, he grew ever skinnier. He came to look, someone said, like one of the prehistoric skeletons that he had spent his whole career digging up.
He does have kind of like a vampire vibe to him or something going in some of the illustrations I've seen of him.
Yeah, a very spooky character. And also a kind of brilliant politician in the sense of game player, friends with everybody. He was friends with Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. He taught science to their children. He was a friend of Charles Dickens. everyone in Victorian society who was anyone was somehow in Richard Owen's orbit. He was not only terribly capable, but eager to demonstrate to everyone just how capable he was.
That's interesting. He had so many friends because he also had so many feuds.
Yeah.
He was quite fierce, but he was the kind of person who would, if he met you, you would be thrilled to meet him. He would be so interested. He would be so charming. He would be so delighted. And then he would turn to the person next to you and would happily trash you 5 minutes later. Charles Darwin knew him, and Darwin was one of the mildest mannered people who ever lived. He hardly raised his voice, very quiet, very humble man. But Darwin said about Richard Owen, he said, "I've always made a point of not hating anyone. But in the case of Richard Owen, I'm willing to make an exception. I shall hate him to my dying day."
That says something.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've encountered quite a few people that weren't big fans of Richard Owens, but it's interesting because it almost sounds like the way you're describing it, if you were in paleontology or if you were sort of in his field, he saw you as a competitor and he might want to like steal some of your ideas or otherwise just get the glory as much as possible. But if you're maybe in a different industry like Charles Dickens or the Queen or something, he might be happy to be a little more friendly and, just enjoy the fruits of his fame.
Well, that's a good way to say it. He was genuinely a cultured man. He was a musician. He not only knew Dickens, but had lots of opinions about literature and writing and that kind of thing. You're right. If you ventured to too near his professional specialties, he might elbow you pretty sharply. But making the picture even more complicated than that is he was genuinely skilled, genuinely knowledgeable. It's Richard Owen that this story is about, and it's a true story of him being shown a single bone from a creature in New Zealand. And he says, he extrapolates that from this bone, he says, there was once a bird, a bigger than ostrich bird wandering around New Zealand. And this bone is the clue, this single bone I hold in my hand. And that was ridiculed. This New Zealand's a tiny place. This is a huge bird. You say this, how come nobody talked about that? And the scientific journal that he wanted to publish his theory in said, well, you can publish it so long as you say this is your idea, not ours, because we don't want to be associated with this. And so Owen does go out on that limb, and for a couple of years gets no word from New Zealand that anybody has found any more bones or any such thing. And he's in a panic that, wow, I have really said a very public and very foolish thing. And then in the mail, this enormous box comes with all sorts of bones in it. And what it is someone has found one of these moas. Owen was right all along. There is this colossal bird. It did live until relatively recent times. And there's a famous photograph of Owen proudly holding in his hand the single bone he started with. And next to him is this reconstructed enormous moa skeleton as if to say, I told you so.
Yeah. That is fantastic.
Yeah.
And that is sort of like the thing that sets some paleontologists apart, that ability to look at a single bone and have such an understanding of so many animals that you can identify it. It's
Yes.
remarkable.
Yeah, the greatest of them all was a French scientist named Cuvier. You mentioned him before. And Cuvier was so skilled and had such a daunting reputation that in one of the Sherlock Holmes stories, someone compares Holmes. Oh my God, you're so brilliant. From a tiny clue, you can see an entire biography. You're like almost as great as Cuvier himself. And that was the highest compliment anyone in that era could think of.
Yeah. And you can see too why these other scientists who were really interested in learning about the ancient world were always sending Cuvier and Owen their fossils, because they would find something and be like, what is this? Well, I know the guy who will be able to figure it out.
Risky though. Risky if you send.
It is true.
Yeah, it was this astonishing thing, because if you don't know quite what you're looking at, what you found is roadkill. Here's a bunch of bones. And if you do know, you can see, and Cuvier not only said, here's what how these bones would fit together, But he said, well, if you see how the bones are set, then you can guess at how the muscles sat in those bones. And if you can guess about the muscles, well, then you can maybe say something about what the coat would have been like. And so he reconstructed mentally entire animals from these tiny, tiny clues. So there were part of the fun of my book is that you had absolutely brilliant scientists knocking their heads against the wall, trying to answer a riddle that a 6-year-old today could sort out for them. Oh, once upon a time, there were dinosaurs. But with that said, we shouldn't downplay that these eccentric scientists really were brilliant. They had taken on a giant, hard riddle, and they figured out terrific and surprising things.
Yes. And then not only are the Victorians, they're grappling with these bigger questions and these things that make them kind of rethink their whole world, but then kind of going back to these feuds amongst themselves, which reminded me of Gideon Mantell, who it sounded like he spent a lot of his life just trying to get approval from people for his work.
Yeah, he had a terribly sad life. He was one of the great fossil finders early on, obsessed with fossils and then dinosaurs when he begins to find them. So obsessed that he, at one point, literally turns his house into a museum. Eventually, his wife, who has first been his ally and then his kind of grudging partner and then his outraged spouse at some point, where are we going to live? She decides she can't take it anymore. But Mantell, it's not clear which is the better way to say it, and Owen knock heads. And Owen is a much more sophisticated game player than Mantell is. And so, although it's Mantell who makes the finds, it's Owen who names them. These are dinosaurs. So Mantell is outraged. I did the work. I found these things. And now everybody thinks that Owen is the man.
Right.
And he was right about that.
Yeah.
Everyone did think that Owen was the man. It seems to be true as well, although Mantell has his defenders, that Owen was a deeper figure intellectually. He grasped more. But there's always a split in science between field work and theory. And often it's the theoreticians who have more prestige. So in things like physics, there's some people actually are looking through telescopes, and some people are doing arcane calculations based on what those observers found. And generally speaking, it's the theoreticians who are the names, the Stephen Hawkings of this world.
Yeah. I feel like there's almost another theme to your book about all these people who are at the forefront of the science of the day, and they're so enthusiastic and engaged and they're doing so much great work, but a lot of them had very sad endings.
Yeah, it was part of what went on is that science wasn't the institution that it is today. So now you can apply for grants or get university jobs, that kind of thing. Not that it's so easy, but at least there are pathways to a career. That was all just being invented along with the science itself at this time. So Mantell, for instance, was a doctor by profession, but so obsessed with his fossil collecting that he didn't devote enough time maybe to building his practice. But he was trying to scrape out a living, opening this museum, as I say, with no real institutional support. He was a shoemaker's son, so he was working class background, which for us might have certain kind of Horatio Alger notions to it. That would be admirable that he worked himself up for nothing. But for the Victorians, who had a very hierarchical notion of place, this meant that he was a figure not quite to be listened to. And the biggest names tended to have private fortunes. Darwin was a country gentleman who never had to hold a job. He could work away in private on his own questions. It so happens he was brilliant. He got away with it, but he had time to pursue his questions in a way that Mary Anning, say, or Gideon Mantell never could. They had to scrape to get by, and often they didn't quite.
Well, even William Buckland, well, his was a bit of a different story, but just the way his story ended was also, I didn't realize until I read your book how sad it was.
Yeah, Buckland was the one who had the dinners of mice on toast and that kind of thing. Maybe independently of that, maybe because one of the ostriches or crocodiles or something he ate wasn't such a good idea. He ended up with some mysterious mental illness that accounts of the time don't describe in a way that let us diagnose it. But something went terribly wrong at not a terribly old age, in his 60s. He took on all these strange habits. He would claw at his head and perhaps slap himself, and his wife, his devoted wife, the one who helped him hoist the tortoise on the table so they could look at his footprints, doesn't know what to do and goes to every doctor and everyone she could think of for help and for diagnosis, and nobody comes up with anything. And he ends up, Buckland, this great, brilliant, innovative figure, ends up committed to a madhouse while his family just waits for the sad end to descend, which it fairly quickly does.
Although on a lighter note, at least one of his sons, right, went on to kind of follow in his footsteps.
Yeah, during the good years, Buckland was fantastically enthusiastic and exciting, and his passion for science became a family affair. His wife was not only lifting tortoises onto the table, but she was a quite skilled scientific illustrator. They worked together. He had kids, as you say, who went on these family outings, gathering fossils and looking at creatures. And one of them became kind of a David Attenborough of the next generation of Victorians. He was who you would turn to learn how the natural world, the living world, worked.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've seen some of her illustrations, his wife's illustrations, and they are really beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, by happenstance, or maybe not by happenstance, several of the women in our story were genuinely skilled illustrators. Mary Anning was William Buckland's wife, partly because drawing was a skill that was cultivated in Victorian times. Young women were meant to develop beautiful handwriting and drawing and a little musical talent. And if you're genuinely good, you could go farther than that. But the flip side of that is you might be excluded from a full-fledged scientific career on your own. So if you were terribly bright and involved and curious, this might be your pathway to important scientific work of your own, to make these careful, meticulous illustrations.
Well, I never made that connection before, because I think of like the stereotypical older jobs for women who were allowed to work, and I think of things like being a teacher and things like that. I didn't realize that emphasis on penmanship and grace, and that included illustrating, and that's why some of them were such good scientific illustrators. That's really interesting. Definitely an unintended consequence, because that's not what the people encouraging their daughters to draw were thinking, like, you should be a scientific illustrator. But that's cool.
It was funny too. The Victorian era was not only obsessed with fossils and dinosaur bones and this kind of thing, but with nearly everything to do with natural history. People collected seashells. This was the first era of having aquariums with fish in them at home and growing every kind of plant you could think of. Queen Victoria had a seaweed album. She would collect particularly handsome bits of seaweed and put them in a scrapbook and label them. And this was a common thing to do. It was like knitting or quilting today. This wasn't an eccentric habit. This was a way of paying homage to the beauty and the glory of creation. You didn't take it for granted. You would collect butterflies or beetles or seaweed. You would put seashells in a place of honor in your home. And so it's not a surprise that a culture that so valued that kind of natural beauty would be just gaga with excitement when they found things like a skeleton too big to fit in a room.
Yeah.
Which kind of brings me to the end of your book. Of course, there's Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins and the Crystal Palace dinosaurs, and that's kind of what I was waiting for while I was reading the whole book based on your title.
Yeah. And a little bit the illustration with the dinner party affiliated with dinosaurs.
Although that's I'm glad we got to talk about the other aspects of dinosaur dinner parties.
Yeah.
But you're right. That's meant to be a little kind of Easter egg that there's something about a dinner party going on. And then the payoff at the end is the Victorians are so pleased with themselves that they finally figured out what these dinosaurs are, that they throw this great celebratory banquet for themselves with all our heroes in it, with Owen at the head of the table and the rest of his fellow scientists gathered around in a giant cutout dinosaur. This is they have triumphed as they saw it, that once there were these fierce creatures and we have explained them and subdued them. It was kind of the dinner equivalent of those photographs you used to see sometimes of a great white hunter standing with his foot on a lion or a rhinoceros and holding his rifle and posing as if to say, look what a big fellow I am. And so here they had subdued in their minds an even bigger creature. This was a Victorian triumph. Look what we have done. And so on New Year's Eve in 1853, the toasts and the drinking and the celebration went on deep into the night inside this huge cutout dinosaur.
Yeah. And they had a menu published with that meal too, and it was a little bit strange, which seems like it was up at least some of their alleys.
Yeah, it was. The Victorians were excellent at excess, and so it was. The menu went on and on with every kind of delicacy, and some of them a little cringe making, but nonetheless in huge excess, and every kind of drink, just bathtubs full of liquor and wine and champagne.
Great. Well, for our listeners, where is the best place for them to find out more about you and your work? Do you have a spot online?
Yeah, look up my name. It's Edward Dolnick, Dolnick, edwarddolnick.net, or go to your friendly bookstore, Dinosaurs at the Dinner Party. It's a good yarn.
Yes, and it is out now, so definitely recommend reading it. It's got a lot of great stories, a lot of great history of dinosaurs, and also the people who discovered them.
Yeah, elements of their lives we hadn't heard before, so very enjoyable.
Terrific. Yes, it's fun. It's not homework.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, it was a treat for me. Thanks very much.
Thanks again, Edward. That was a fantastic discussion. I learned so much about how Victorians viewed the world.
And how their view was upended.
Yeah, I really enjoyed a lot of those details about just how interested they were in nature. It was really cool to hear. And dinosaurs, by extension.
Yes. Yes, so thank you. And we will get to our dinosaur of the day in just a moment, but first we're going to take a quick break for our sponsors. And now onto our dinosaur of the day, Theiophytalia, which was a request from PaleoMike716 via our Patreon and Discord, so thanks. Theiophytalia was an Iguanodontian dinosaur that lived in the early Cretaceous in what is now Colorado in the US. It lived about 125 to 100 million years ago. Originally, it was thought to be Camptosaurus, kind of like how Coahuilasaurus was thought to be a different kind of hadrosaur.
Happens a lot. Things get reclassified.
Yeah. Theiophytalia did look similar to Camptosaurus, which was our dinosaur of the day back in episode 7, so it's been a while.
Just 7, not 70 something.
Yeah,
just straight
one
up 7.
digit. I would say it also looks similar to Iguanodon, to paint a picture. It could walk on all fours or just two. It had a bulky body, a long tail. Its arms were shorter than its legs. It had a long skull. It is estimated to be about 26 to 30 feet or 8 to 9 meters long. It sense a trend here. It's like the third dinosaur you mentioned in that range.
Right around 30 feet or a little less.
Yeah. The type and only species is Theiophytalia curri. It was named in 2006 by Kathleen Brill and Kenneth Carpenter. It was named based on a partial skull that was first found back in 1878 by James Kerr, hence the curri. Kerr had graduated from Yale, and he had tuberculosis, so he went west to find a cure. He became a professor of geology and mining at Colorado College and started hunting for fossils, and he ended up sending that partial skull to O.C. Marsh, so yes, this is a bone war dinosaur.
So he went to find a cure and he got a degree in geology?
Well, he already had the degree in geology
Oh,
from
okay.
Yale, but then he got tuberculosis, so he went west.
I see. I was thinking he was like, I'm going to find a cure for tuberculosis. Step 1, get a degree in geology.
No, I don't think that's what happened.
Okay. So it seems like the wrong course of study if you're looking for cures.
Yes. I think it was more about being out in the fresh air,
Okay.
if I had to guess.
Yeah. Whatever the thinking of the time was in terms of what type of air is best for tuberculosis.
Yes. So he ended up sending that partial skull to Marsh, but Marsh probably sought out the skull first because he had heard about Kerr's discovery of dinosaur bones and sent H.C. Beckwith to investigate, who confirmed to Marsh that yes, there were dinosaur bones. And it seems that Marsh took credit for collecting the skull, or at least the record of the skull in the archives suggests so.
No mention of Kerr on it.
Not from what I read, but I didn't see the actual record. Marsh thought the skull came from the Morrison Formation. Spoilers, it didn't, but that's why he referred the skull in 1887 to Camptosaurus. At the time, in Marsh's defense, he was getting a lot of specimens from the Bone Wars digs over a period of 8 years, including similar Camptosaurus skulls that had been found in Wyoming. So I could see where the mix-up would happen.
Because he's got all these Morrison bones, and he's like, oh yeah, this must just be another one of the Morrison bones.
Yeah. And Charles Gilmore, 1909, used that skull to reconstruct the skull of Camptosaurus. It's because not many Camptosaurus skulls or skull material has been found. At the time that Kerr found the fossil, Colorado College didn't have a place to store them, and many of the boxes placed in barns and cellars have been lost, unfortunately.
I wonder why you'd ever lose a box if you just threw it in a random barn.
You make do with what you have.
I guess so.
I think it's what happened there. Kerr wrote, quote, "In 1878, I discovered in one of the ridges east of the Red Rocks forming the east boundary of the Garden of the Gods portions of 21 sea monsters that had been caught as in a basin in one of Earth's early paroxysms. There were many vertebrae of large size. Some of them were well preserved. Of the large animal in the form of a saurian, we could find only casts of parts. From the lay of these parts, we calculated that the animal was 117 feet in length. Most of the bones and some of the casts were boxed up for Colorado College. The college at that time having no place to store such things, the boxes were placed in barns and cellars, and nearly all have been lost."
Oh, they were already lost in 1878.
Yeah, that's too bad.
Oh, he was writing about 1878. So whenever he wrote this.
Yes, but it wouldn't have been that long after.
Yeah.
So what happened here was, after studying the skull, Brill and Carpenter found that there was soil on it that matched soil from the Cretaceous, not from the Jurassic. And that's when they thought, hey, maybe this isn't Camptosaurus. It was unclear where exactly the skull was found, and they only had the note that Kerr wrote to go by, as well as that matching soil. So they figured out that it came from somewhere in the little member of the Purgatoire Formation, and that it was from the early Cretaceous.
Also known as the Picket Wire Formation.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, that's what Bruce Schumacher told us way back when we interviewed him about it.
Good memory. Theiophytalia lived on a warm, lush shoreline on the edge of an inland sea, and that shallow sea had a lot of sharks, fish, clams, plesiosaurs, and birds. It's possible the dinosaur washed out to sea, and that's how the skull was preserved. Brill and Carpenter, when they looked, they found some differences in the skull that made Theiophytalia unique. It was longer, heavier, and had a more wrinkled snout compared to Camptosaurus, just as some examples. They also found it was more closely related to Iguanodon than Camptosaurus, although its closest relative is Hippodraco. Hippodraco is an Iguanodontian ornithopod. It was named in 2010. It lived in the early Cretaceous in what's now Utah in the US, and its genus name means horse dragon. And it was named that way because it had a long shape that looked somewhat like a horse skull.
Yeah, I think that a lot when I look at hadrosaur heads.
Mm-hmm.
They look a little bit more horse-like, although not really like a horse skull, because horse skulls have that big chunk missing in the front where the big fleshy nose is. So they have like kind of a spike to them.
Yeah.
But in the general proportions.
So back to Theiophytalia. That genus name means divine garden or garden of the gods. And it was named for the Garden of the Gods, which is a park in Colorado Springs, Colorado, where the skull was found. And the species name is in honor of James Hutchinson Kerr. That's how you get Kerr-eye. The Garden of the Gods is a 1,300-acre national park, and it's got these limestone and sandstone formations that span about 300 million years.
Yeah, it's pretty famous.
Yeah, it was named back in 1859 by surveyors from Denver who, when they saw the rock formations, said it was a place fit for gods to assemble. Theiophytalia was probably an adult, the skull that it's named on, based on fused bones in the skull. And that skull's estimated to be over 18 inches or almost 47 centimeters long. So it's in between Camptosaurus and Iguanodon in size. And you can see a replica of Theiophytalia at Garden of the Gods Visitor and Nature Center. So it's got an interesting history.
I always like hearing about the Bone Wars dinosaurs,
Me too.
even though a lot of times they have a very long, complicated history. This one's a little bit more succinct.
Yes. Marsh got it wrong. Again.
Yep. Everybody got it wrong. Thinking it was 117 feet long. Although I guess that was other animals.
Yeah.
But
at least Kerr got credit in the species name.
True. Before we get into the fun fact, we're going to announce who won our Dino-It-All challenge. And that was Matt. So congratulations, Matt. We will be mailing you your prize soon.
Well, we'll probably have mailed it by the time this episode airs.
Oh, yeah, if we really have our stuff together.
Yeah, so keep an eye out. And thank you for participating. Thank you, everybody, for participating. That was a fun challenge for us to put together. And I appreciate everyone who donated for that Dynamite prize package. Toy Monster, Mini Museum, Why Dinosaurs, and Ancient Odysseys. Thank you.
Yes, but if you didn't win, don't feel bad because we had almost 900 entries into the contest.
Yes, which is why I want to say thank you, everyone, for taking the time to answer those questions.
It was fun coming up with all those stories and the answers, questions, and everything. I'm not sure if we're going to do another one of these contests. We'll have to see. We'll do a survey and see how much people liked them. And maybe we'll coincide another one of these when something else is going on that is prize-worthy. We'll have to see.
And now on to our fun fact, which is, again, that matching dinosaur tracks have been found on 2 different continents over 3,700 miles or 6,000 kilometers apart. This was published by Louis Jacobs and others in the New Mexico Museum of Natural History and Science Bulletin, and it's a tribute to the late Martin Lockley, who's known for his work on dinosaur tracks.
So I assume that one set of the tracks was found in New Mexico?
Neither tracks were in New Mexico.
Is it like Brazil and Africa?
It is.
Okay.
Cameroon in Central Africa and Brazil in South America.
Because now they're 3,700 miles apart, but they may not have been when those tracks formed. That's what I was thinking.
When they formed, they were about 620 miles or 1,000 kilometers apart.
That is much closer, but still really far apart. Farther than I was expecting.
Yes. So that was before the continents split. So those tracks were on the same landmass, but they were still far apart, so it's not considered to be a mega track site, which are sometimes known as dinosaur freeways, because there's a lack of continuity. But they do contain a lot of footprints, and they help show the dinosaur path or corridor. This is known now as the Early Cretaceous Dinosaur Dispersal Corridor. And it's one of the last places that dinosaurs and other animals could cross before the continents broke apart completely. What's now Africa and South America started splitting apart about 140 million years ago. And this corridor is one of the youngest, narrowest geological connections between the 2 continents. And it was part of northeastern Brazil and the coast of Cameroon. These prints are from the early Cretaceous over 120 million years ago. There's more than 260 footprints of ornithopods, sauropods, and theropods. And the footprints were made in mud and silt along ancient rivers and lakes. They were found in similar sediments, both sets.
So they were sticking to the rivers and the lakes that they're used to? Is that what you're saying?
Wow. Well done. I know that's one of your favorite songs.
That was a good one.
Anyway, so they were found in similar sediments. That's one clue that they went together. Also, the age of the footprints are from around the same time. They were found in similar geological and plate tectonic contexts. There's signs of rifts and the Earth's crust pulling apart and forming faults. These are all signs of the continents splitting apart. Also, fossil pollen shows that it's from about 120 million years ago. But what really puts that nail in the coffin is that the shapes of these footprints are nearly identical.
The coffin in this case is that they're the same dinosaurs?
Yeah.
Okay.
Same types of dinosaurs. So again, even though they were made far apart 120 million years ago, it does help show this dinosaur path or corridor where they were moving between the continents before they completely split apart.
Between South America and Africa?
Yes.
That's cool. Because there was a lot of circumstantial evidence with dinosaurs that looked similar that we only really find in South America and Africa. Like you have some Spinosaurids and Carcharodontosaurs and things like that, where it's like, oh, we mostly see these in Africa and South America, maybe a little splash of them on some of the European archipelago of the time. But you'd presume that there was a lot going back and forth, and then eventually you can tell when the continents got far enough apart that they couldn't travel back and forth, and there was a little bit more difference between the two. But to actually have the tracks showing that they were moving between the continents potentially in that area is really cool.
It is cool.
That's cool too, because Cameroon is sort of the nook in Africa where Brazil used to be tucked into. So you can imagine how those were once really touching, basically the same landmass, like you were saying.
And those dinosaurs took advantage of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that wraps up this episode of I Know Dino. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned. Next week, we've got another new dinosaur, this time a ceratopsian. They just keep coming. And again, we appreciate all of our Dino-it-alls in our Patreon community. You are what allows us to keep going, especially when we have big life events like expecting a baby. So if you want to join our growing community that's full of fun dinosaur enthusiasts, then head over to patreon.com/iknowdino. Thanks again, and until next time.